There comes a moment in life when a person who once loved deeply stops begging to be chosen, not because they stopped caring, not because their heart became cold, but because they finally discovered something far more powerful than the approval they were chasing. They discovered their own worth. And when that moment arrives for a deeply empathetic person, something extraordinary happens. The energy shifts. The person who once poured their soul into someone who could not receive it begins to pour that same devotion back into their own life. And that transformation creates a radiance that is impossible to ignore. See, the deeply empathetic person was never weak. They were simply loving someone who didn't yet know how to meet them in that depth. While the avoidant was busy protecting themselves from vulnerability, the empath was offering a rare kind of connection, the kind that sees past the walls, the kind that recognizes the wounds behind the silence. But when that love is not honored, something sacred begins to awaken inside the empath. Pain becomes clarity, disappointment becomes wisdom, and slowly, the person who once waited for messages, explanations, and emotional availability begins to build a life so full, so grounded, and so peaceful that they no longer need the person who walked away. This is where the shift becomes powerful, because the avoidant expected something very different. They expected the empath to remain in the same place emotionally, to stay orbiting around the memory of what could have been. They expected that if they ever returned, the door would still be open exactly the same way they left it. But growth changes people, and the empath, who once tolerated emotional distance, now recognizes it immediately. The empath who once over-explained their feelings now speaks with calm certainty. The empath who once waited now walks forward. That transformation creates a new kind of presence. It is not loud. It is not performative. It is simply a quiet confidence that says, I know who I am now. And that is the moment the avoidant begins to feel something they didn't expect. Regret, because distance has a strange way of revealing value. When someone is always there, always understanding, always patient, their love can be taken for granted. But when that person evolves and their life moves forward without you, the mind begins to replay the moments that once felt ordinary. The late night conversations, the way they understood things you never said out loud, the safety you felt when they looked at you with genuine care. Suddenly those moments feel rare. And the avoidant begins to realize something uncomfortable. They did not leave someone ordinary. They walked away from someone who truly saw them. But by the time that realization arrives, the empath has already crossed a powerful threshold. They are no longer trying to convince someone to stay. They are no longer trying to shrink themselves to make someone comfortable. They are no longer abandoning their own needs in order to keep a connection alive. Instead, they are building a life aligned with truth, purpose, and emotional integrity. And there is something incredibly magnetic about a person who has done that inner work. Their presence changes, their conversations deepen, their boundaries become clear, their energy becomes peaceful rather than desperate. This is the new radiance. It is not about revenge. It is not about proving anything to the person who left. It is simply the natural glow of someone who has reclaimed their own soul. When a person stops chasing love and starts living with self-respect, the world responds differently to them. Opportunities appear. Relationships become healthier. Their intuition sharpens. They begin attracting people who recognize their value rather than questioning it. And the avoidant, looking from a distance, begins to understand a painful truth. The person they once thought would always be there has become someone they can no longer easily access, not because the empath became bitter, but because they became whole. And there is a profound life lesson hidden in that transformation. The right people in your life are not meant to be chased. They are meant to meet you with the same sincerity you bring to them. Love is not supposed to feel like convincing someone of your worth. Real connection is a place where both people show up with courage, honesty, and emotional presence. The empath eventually realizes that their greatest strength was never their ability to hold on to someone who was leaving. Their greatest strength was their ability to grow, to take heartbreak and turn it into self-knowledge, to take rejection and turn it into alignment, to take loss and turn it into purpose. And when a person walks that path, They become something extraordinary. They become someone who no longer fears being left because they have finally learned how to stay loyal to themselves. That is the moment when their life begins to shine in a completely different way. And sometimes, far behind them, someone who once walked away finally realizes the truth they were too afraid to see before they didn't lose someone who needed them. They lost someone who loved them deeply and then learned how to love themselves even more. There is a profound shift that happens when a deeply empathetic person finally stops chasing validation from someone who cannot give it. For a long time, their energy was directed outward. They tried to understand every silence, decode every mixed signal, and interpret every moment of distance as something they needed to fix. They believed that if they loved harder, communicated better, or proved their loyalty long enough, eventually the other person would see their value and meet them in the same emotional space. But the problem was never a lack of love. The problem was that their love was being poured into a place that could not fully receive it. When the empath finally realizes this truth, it changes everything. Not overnight, not in some dramatic explosion of anger or resentment, but in a quiet and powerful internal awakening. They begin to see that the constant search for reassurance was slowly draining the very essence of who they were. They were giving their emotional energy away piece by piece, hoping that someday it would come back multiplied. Instead, it left them feeling exhausted and unseen. And then something remarkable happens. The empath begins to redirect that same energy inward. The compassion they once gave endlessly to someone else now starts to flow back toward themselves. The patience they once showed someone who struggled to communicate now becomes patience with their own healing. The kindness they once used to excuse someone else's behavior becomes kindness toward their own heart. This is where the transformation begins, because the empath realizes that love was never meant to be something they had to earn. Love was something they already carried within them. The mistake was believing that another person needed to confirm their worth before they could feel secure in it. When that belief dissolves, the energy that once chased approval turns into something far more powerful. It becomes presence. Instead of constantly worrying about whether they are enough, they begin showing up in the world with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing their intentions are pure. They no longer feel the urge to over-explain their feelings or convince someone to understand them. Their truth becomes simple, grounded, and calm. This shift in energy is subtle, but incredibly magnetic. People can sense when someone is no longer seeking validation. There is a peacefulness in the way they speak, a steadiness in their decisions, and a strength in their boundaries. They are no longer performing for acceptance. They are simply living in alignment with who they truly are. For someone who once felt invisible in a relationship, this new state of being feels almost sacred. They start investing in the things that nourish their spirit. They reconnect with passions that were pushed aside while they were busy trying to maintain a fragile connection. They build friendships that feel mutual and uplifting. They begin to prioritize environments where their presence is appreciated rather than tolerated. And with every step they take in this direction, their energy expands. The beautiful irony is that the very love they once tried to give someone else now becomes the source of their own strength. Their empathy does not disappear, but it becomes wiser. They learn that empathy without boundaries can lead to emotional self-abandonment. True empathy must include compassion for oneself. This realization creates a kind of radiance that cannot be faked. It is not the loud confidence of someone trying to prove something to the world. It is the calm glow of someone who finally understands their own value. They move through life differently now. They listen more deeply to their intuition. They respect their emotional needs instead of minimizing them. They recognize when a connection is balanced and when it is not. And because they are no longer desperate to be chosen, their presence becomes far more powerful. The energy of someone who is whole is naturally attractive. Not because they are trying to impress anyone, but because authenticity has a way of drawing people in. When a person embodies their own worth, they create an atmosphere where real connection becomes possible. What once looked like vulnerability in the empath now reveals itself as strength. Their ability to love deeply was never the problem. The only thing that needed to change was where that love was directed. And once that love returns home to them, Everything about their presence begins to shine in a completely new way. One of the most confusing experiences for someone who loves deeply is trying to understand why a person who once felt close suddenly begins to pull away. For the empathetic individual, connection is something meaningful and sacred. When they open their heart to someone, they do it with sincerity, curiosity, and emotional presence. They want to understand the other person's inner world. They want to build something real. So when the other person begins to distance themselves, it can feel both painful and bewildering. But the truth is that emotional depth can be overwhelming for someone who has spent most of their life protecting themselves from vulnerability. For an avoidant personality, closeness often triggers an internal alarm. The moment a connection begins to feel real, the moment someone starts seeing beneath the surface, their instinct is to step back, not necessarily because they do not care, but because caring makes them feel exposed. When an empath enters their life, the experience can be even more intense. Empaths have a natural ability to notice subtle emotional cues. They sense the unsaid words, the hidden fears, and the quiet insecurities that others often overlook. They are comfortable having deeper conversations and exploring feelings that many people prefer to keep hidden. To someone who is emotionally avoidant, that kind of awareness can feel both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On one hand, they may feel understood in a way they have never experienced before. The empath may recognize parts of them that no one else has seen. They may offer patience, warmth, and emotional safety. But on the other hand, being seen so clearly removes the protective distance that the avoidant person relies on to feel in control. And when someone feels emotionally exposed without having the tools to handle it, their instinct is often to retreat. They might convince themselves that the connection is too intense, too complicated, or moving too fast. They may create logical explanations for leaving, even though the deeper reason lies in their discomfort with vulnerability. From the outside, it can look like indifference or lack of interest, but internally, it is often a struggle between wanting connection and fearing what it requires. So they walk away. At first, the distance can feel relieving to them. Space allows them to return to familiar emotional territory, where they do not have to confront feelings that make them uncomfortable. Without the empath's presence reflecting their inner world back to them, they regain a sense of control. But time has a powerful way of shifting perspective. When the emotional intensity fades and life returns to its routine rhythm, the avoidant person may begin to notice something missing. The conversations they once had with the empath were different. The level of understanding they experienced was rare. The empathy they received was not something easily replaced. They may try to distract themselves with other connections, but many interactions begin to feel surface level in comparison. The empath had a way of listening that made them feel genuinely known. They had a way of asking questions that encouraged honesty rather than performance. Gradually, the avoidant person begins to realize that what once felt overwhelming was also incredibly meaningful. Distance has a way of highlighting value. When something extraordinary becomes absent, the mind starts to replay the moments that once felt ordinary. The laughter, the emotional support, the sense of being accepted without judgment. These memories begin to carry a new weight. The person they left behind starts to appear in a different light. What once felt like emotional intensity now looks like sincerity. What once felt uncomfortable now appears as courage. The empath's willingness to show up authentically becomes something rare in a world where many people hide behind emotional walls. This is often when regret quietly begins to emerge. Not always in dramatic realizations, but in small reflections that appear unexpectedly. A conversation that reminds them of what they lost. A moment of loneliness where they remember how safe they once felt. A realization that someone who truly understood them was standing right in front of them, and they were too afraid to stay. By the time this understanding arrives, the empath may already be walking a different path, growing stronger and wiser from the experience. And that realization can make the avoidant person confront a difficult truth. Sometimes, the very thing that felt too deep to handle was actually the most genuine connection they were ever offered. There is a powerful transformation that takes place when a deeply empathetic person begins the journey of healing after experiencing emotional disappointment. At first, the pain can feel overwhelming. When someone who loves deeply is rejected, ignored, or left behind, the immediate reaction is often self-questioning. They replay conversations in their mind, wondering what they could have done differently. They search for answers in every detail, hoping to find the exact moment where things went wrong. For someone with a deeply compassionate nature, this stage can feel especially heavy. Empaths tend to internalize responsibility for the emotional environment around them. They want harmony, understanding, and connection. When a relationship falls apart, they may believe that if they had been more patient, more understanding, or less intense, things might have turned out differently. But healing slowly begins when they realize a profound truth. Not every ending is a failure, and not every person who leaves was meant to stay. Healing is rarely quick or simple. It is often a gradual process where the empath learns to sit with their emotions instead of running from them. They begin to acknowledge the hurt honestly rather than pretending it did not matter. In doing so, they start reclaiming parts of themselves that were lost while trying to keep someone else comfortable. One of the most important shifts happens when the empath stops measuring their worth through another person's ability to appreciate them. For a long time, their sense of value may have been tied to whether someone chose them, stayed with them, or recognized the depth of their love. But healing teaches them that self-worth cannot be built on someone else's emotional availability. True self-worth grows from self-respect. As the empath reflects on the relationship, they begin to see things more clearly. They recognize the ways they showed up with sincerity and care. They remember how much emotional effort they invested in trying to make the connection work. And instead of seeing those qualities as weaknesses, they start to recognize them as strengths. Their ability to love deeply was never something to be ashamed of. The difference now is that they begin pairing that love with wisdom. They learn that empathy must coexist with boundaries. They discover that understanding someone's pain does not mean accepting behavior that hurts them. They realize that compassion does not require sacrificing their own emotional well-being. This awareness slowly rebuilds their sense of inner stability. Instead of seeking reassurance from someone who could not provide it, they start building reassurance from within. They invest time in personal growth, emotional reflection, and activities that reconnect them with their own identity. The things they once neglected while focusing on the relationship begin to reappear in their life. Passions return. Creativity awakens. Friendships deepen. Through these experiences, the empath begins to see themselves in a new light. They are no longer defined by the loss they experienced. They are defined by the strength it took to grow beyond it. And with this growth comes a subtle but powerful confidence. It is not the loud confidence that demands attention or validation. Instead, it is a quiet certainty that settles within them. They know what they bring into a relationship. They know the value of their emotional intelligence, their kindness, and their ability to connect deeply with others. This quiet confidence changes the way they move through the world. They stop over-explaining themselves. They no longer feel the need to chase people who give mixed signals. They become more selective about who they allow into their emotional space, not out of fear, but out of respect for their own heart. People begin to notice this change. The empath's presence feels different now. There is a calmness in their energy that comes from knowing who they are. There is clarity in their words because they are no longer trying to be everything for everyone. They simply show up as their authentic self. Ironically, the very pain that once felt like it would break them becomes the catalyst for their most powerful transformation. Their healing journey turns heartbreak into self-knowledge, their reflectio, and turns confusion into wisdom, and their willingness to grow transforms their natural empathy into something even more magnetic. What once made them feel vulnerable now becomes the foundation of their strength. Their emotional depth, combined with the lessons they have learned, creates a presence that feels both warm and grounded. It is this combination, compassion guided by self-respect, that forms the quiet confidence that others cannot help but notice. One of the most powerful transformations in the life of a deeply empathetic person happens when they finally begin to understand the importance of boundaries. For a long time, the empath may have believed that love meant limitless patience. They thought that being supportive meant always understanding, always forgiving, and always giving another chance. Their instinct was to create emotional space for others, especially for those who struggle to express themselves. In many ways, this compassion is one of the empath's most beautiful qualities. They see the humanity in people even when others overlook it. They can recognize pain beneath defensive behavior and insecurity beneath silence. Because of this awareness, they often try to help others feel safe enough to open up. But when this empathy exists without boundaries, it can slowly turn into self-sacrifice. The empath may begin tolerating emotional inconsistency that slowly erodes their sense of peace. They might accept delayed responses, mixed signals, or long periods of emotional distance because they believe the other person simply needs time and understanding. They convince themselves that if they remain patient long enough, the other person will eventually recognize their love and meet them halfway. Unfortunately, this pattern often leads to a quiet form of emotional exhaustion. The empath keeps giving energy while receiving uncertainty in return. They continue showing up with sincerity, while the other person remains distant or unavailable. Over time, they start feeling confused about where they truly stand. Their emotional needs become secondary to maintaining the connection. Eventually, however, the empath reaches a moment of clarity. It usually comes after repeated cycles of disappointment, where promises are not followed by consistent actions. The empath begins to notice that their understanding has been extended far beyond what is healthy. They realize that empathy does not mean accepting behavior that leaves them feeling unseen or unimportant. This realization is the beginning of a powerful shift. Instead of automatically excusing every inconsistency, the empath begins to ask deeper questions. They reflect on how the relationship made them feel. They consider whether their emotional generosity was truly valued or simply taken for granted. And most importantly, they start recognizing that their needs matter just as much as anyone else's. With this awareness, boundaries begin to form. At first, setting boundaries can feel uncomfortable. Empaths are used to prioritizing harmony, so the idea of saying no or stepping back may feel unfamiliar. They might worry about disappointing others or appearing less caring than before. But over time, they realize that boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of self-respect. A boundary simply says, I care about connection, but I also care about my well-being. When the empath begins honoring this principle, their behavior changes in subtle but significant ways. They stop chasing clarity from someone who refuses to communicate openly. They no longer tolerate emotional hot and cold patterns that leave them questioning their value. Instead of over-explaining their feelings, they express their expectations calmly and directly. If those expectations are not respected, they step back. This new behavior can feel surprising to someone who previously experienced the empath as endlessly accommodating. The avoidant person may have grown accustomed to the empath's patience and emotional availability. They might have assumed that the empath would always remain present regardless of how inconsistent the connection became. But boundaries disrupt that expectation. Suddenly, the empath is no longer absorbing all the emotional imbalance in the relationship. They are no longer smoothing over every uncomfortable situation or filling every silence with understanding. Their absence of overcompensation creates space where the other person's behavior becomes more visible. And this is where the truth of the dynamic begins to reveal itself. Without the empath constantly adapting, the avoidant person can no longer hide behind the illusion that everything was fine. The distance they created becomes more obvious. The lack of emotional effort becomes harder to ignore. The patterns that once went unnoticed now stand clearly in the light. For the empath, this clarity is empowering. They realize that healthy love is not about endlessly accommodating someone else's fears. Real connection requires mutual effort, emotional presence, and respect for each other's needs. The empath begins to see that boundaries do not push love away. They actually create the conditions where genuine love can exist. And something remarkable happens when the empath fully embraces this understanding. Their energy becomes more grounded, their interactions become more intentional. They stop trying to manage someone else's emotional world and start focusing on maintaining their own inner balance. In doing so, they reclaim a sense of dignity that may have slowly faded while they were trying to hold the relationship together. The empath is still compassionate. They still care deeply about others. But now that compassion is guided by wisdom, they understand that love should never require them to abandon themselves in the process. Growth has a quiet way of transforming a person, especially someone who has walked through emotional pain and chosen to learn from it instead of becoming bitter. For the deeply empathetic individual, this transformation can be especially profound. What once looked like vulnerability to others slowly evolves into something far more powerful, an inner strength that is grounded, self-aware, and deeply authentic. In the beginning, the empath may have been perceived as overly sensitive or emotionally intense. Their willingness to express feelings openly and care deeply might have been misunderstood as weakness. Some people, particularly those who are uncomfortable with emotional depth, may have interpreted the empath's openness as something fragile or overwhelming. But what they failed to see was that emotional openness requires tremendous courage. It takes strength to be honest about feelings. It takes bravery to care about someone deeply enough to show them your true self. While others may hide behind emotional distance or carefully constructed walls, the empath stands in the truth of their heart. This kind of authenticity is not weakness. It is one of the rarest forms of strength a person can possess. However, when that openness meets rejection or avoidance, the empath is forced into a period of reflection. They begin to question not only the relationship, but also their own approach to love and connection. At first, they might think their vulnerability was the problem. They might believe that if they had been less expressive, less caring, or less emotionally available, the other person would have stayed. But as they grow and gain perspective, a new understanding begins to emerge. They realize that vulnerable, it was never the issue. The issue was sharing that vulnerability with someone who did not yet have the emotional capacity to honor it. The empath begins to see that their openness was actually a reflection of their emotional intelligence, not a flaw that needed to be hidden. This shift in perspective marks the beginning of emotional sovereignty. Instead of suppressing their natural depth, the empath learns how to protect it. They recognize that their emotional awareness is a gift, but like any valuable gift, it must be shared wisely. They no longer offer the most intimate parts of their heart to people who have not demonstrated the ability to respect it. This is where vulnerability transforms into strength. The empath still feels deeply, but now those feelings are guided by discernment. They become more attentive to the energy people bring into their life. They observe actions more carefully. They listen to their intuition instead of ignoring it in the name of compassion. Clarity begins to replace confusion. In the past, the empath may have spent countless hours trying to understand someone else's mixed signals. They might have analyzed every conversation, searching for meaning in inconsistent behavior. But with growth comes the realization that healthy connections rarely require that level of emotional detective work. When someone values you, their actions align with their words. When someone respects you, they show up consistently. This understanding simplifies the empath's emotional world. Instead of chasing explanations, they pay attention to patterns. Instead of overextending themselves, they allow relationships to unfold naturally. This clarity creates a powerful sense of emotional freedom. And with that freedom comes a new radiance. The empath begins to carry themselves differently. Their presence becomes calm and grounded. They are no longer trying to convince anyone of their worth because they have already accepted it within themselves. Their confidence is not loud or performative. It is steady and authentic. People notice this change. What once looked like vulnerability now appears as emotional depth. What once seemed like sensitivity now reveals itself as awareness and empathy. The empath's ability to understand others becomes even more impactful because it is now balanced with self-respect. They no longer lose themselves in someone else's emotional landscape. Instead, They remain centered within their own. This balance between compassion and clarity creates a presence that is both warm and strong. Others feel safe around them, yet they also sense that this is a person who cannot be easily manipulated or taken for granted. The empath has not hardened their heart. They have refined it. Their growth has turned emotional openness into wisdom. Their past pain has become the foundation for stronger boundaries and deeper self-understanding. And the very qualities that once made them feel exposed now shine as the source of their strength and authenticity. There is a moment that often arrives quietly in the mind of someone who once walked away from a deeply empathetic person. It doesn't usually happen immediately after the separation. In the beginning, the distance may feel like relief. Without the emotional closeness, without the conversations that touched vulnerable places inside them, the avoidant person may feel a sense of regained control. Life returns to its familiar rhythm, and the decision to leave can seem justified in their mind. But time has a way of softening the defenses people build around themselves. As the days and months pass, memories begin to surface in unexpected ways. A phrase someone says might remind them of a conversation they once had. A quiet evening might bring back the feeling of being understood in a way that rarely happens with others. Slowly, the emotional intensity that once felt overwhelming begins to look different in hindsight. What once felt like pressure now begins to appear as sincerity. The avoidant person may start reflecting on the way the empath showed up in the relationship. They remember how that person listened without judgment. They recall moments when their silence was understood rather than criticized. They realize that the empath often sensed their feelings even when they struggled to express them. At the time, that level of understanding may have felt uncomfortable. Being seen so clearly can feel exposing for someone who is used to protecting their inner world. With distance, the perspective begins to shift. They begin to understand that what they experienced was not emotional intensity meant to control them. It was genuine care, and genuine care is rare. Conversations revolve around daily events, casual humor, or light observations. While these interactions can be enjoyable, they rarely reach the deeper emotional layers where true connection lives. The empath was different. They were curious about the other person's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. They wanted to understand the motivations behind actions and the emotions beneath silence. They approached connection with openness rather than guardedness. At the time, this depth may have triggered the avoidant person's instinct to withdraw. But as they encounter other relationships that lack the same emotional richness, the contrast becomes more noticeable. They may meet people who are pleasant but distant, friendly but uninterested in deeper conversation. Slowly, they begin to realize that what the empath offered was not something easily found elsewhere. This realization can create an uncomfortable awareness. The avoidant person starts to question the story they once told themselves about the relationship. They may have believed that the empath was too sensitive, too intense, or too emotionally demanding. But now they begin to see that those qualities were actually expressions of emotional intelligence and sincerity. The empath was not asking for too much. They were simply offering a level of connection that required vulnerability in return. And vulnerability was something the avoidant person was not ready to face at the time. Recognizing this can bring a wave of regret that feels both subtle and heavy. It may not always appear as dramatic sorrow, but rather as quiet thoughts that linger longer than expected. They remember moments when the empath tried to communicate openly, moments when understanding was offered without conditions. They begin to see how rare that kind of acceptance truly was. The empath saw qualities in them that they often kept hidden from the world. Instead of judging those parts, the empath approached them with curiosity and compassion. For someone who is used to hiding their deeper emotions, being understood like that is both beautiful and unsettling. And sometimes, only after losing that connection do they fully grasp its value. They realize that the person they left behind was not weak or overly emotional. That person had the courage to show up authentically in a world where many people avoid emotional honesty. The empath's ability to care deeply, communicate sincerely, and remain patient in difficult moments was actually a rare strength. By the time this understanding becomes clear, The empath may already be far along in their own journey of growth and healing. They may no longer be standing in the same place, waiting to be recognized. This is when the avoidant person faces a difficult truth. The person they once thought would be there was someone who truly understood them, and walking away from that kind of connection is not something easily replaced. There is a powerful paradox that often unfolds when a deeply empathetic person finally reaches a place of emotional independence. For a long time, they may have believed that if they could only hold on tightly enough to the relationship, the other person would eventually recognize their value and stay. Their instinct was to nurture the connection, to protect it, and to keep the emotional door open, no matter how uncertain things became. But true transformation begins when the empath stops structuring their life around someone else's potential return. Instead of waiting for clarity or closure from the person who left, they begin focusing on their own growth and well-being. They redirect their emotional energy toward things that strengthen their sense of identity. They invest in friendships that are supportive and mutual. They pursue interests and passions that bring them joy. They start building a life that feels meaningful regardless of who chooses to walk beside them. At first, this shift may feel unfamiliar. The empath was once so accustomed to prioritizing the relationship that reconnecting with themselves requires patience and self-discovery. But with time, something remarkable begins to happen. They start feeling lighter. The emotional tension that once came from constantly analyzing someone else's behavior slowly fades away. The need to decode mixed signals disappears. Instead of worrying about what another person might be thinking or feeling, the empath becomes more present in their own life. This presence creates a new kind of energy. The empath's focus is no longer on being chosen. It is on living authentically. They wake up each day with a clearer sense of purpose. They nurture their emotional health, strengthen their boundary, rise, and surround themselves with people who value sincerity and consistency. This is the moment when independence quietly takes root. The empath realizes that their happiness does not depend on someone returning to complete the story. They are capable of creating fulfillment on their own terms. Their sense of worth becomes internal rather than dependent on another person's approval or attention. And when a person reaches that level of self-awareness, their presence begins to change in a noticeable way. They no longer chase. They no longer seek reassurance from those who cannot offer it. Their calm confidence communicates something powerful without needing to be spoken aloud. They know who they are, and they are no longer willing to abandon themselves for the sake of connection. Ironically, this is often the point when the avoidant person begins to see the empath differently. While the empath was previously waiting, the avoidant may have felt comfortable maintaining distance. They may have believed that the connection would always remain available if they decided to return. The empath's patience might have created the illusion that time was on their side, but independence disrupts that illusion. When the empath stops orbiting around the relationships and starts moving forward with their life, the dynamic shifts completely. The avoidant person may notice that the emotional space they once occupied is no longer the center of the empath's world. The empath is evolving, growing, and creating new experiences without them. This realization can trigger a deeper awareness. The avoidant begins to recognize that the person they once stepped away from is no longer standing in the same place emotionally. The empath's life is expanding, and their energy is no longer invested in waiting for someone who could not fully meet them. What once felt like a connection they could revisit at any time now appears less certain. And this is where the paradox becomes clear. The very independence that frees the empath from the past is also what makes the avoidant recognize what they lost. When someone is constantly available, their value can be overlooked. But when that same person begins living with confidence, purpose, and emotional self-sufficiency, their presence suddenly feels rare. The empath's life becomes a reflection of the growth they achieved after the relationship ended. They carry themselves with quiet assurance. Their conversations are filled with clarity and authenticity. Their energy feels grounded rather than searching. This transformation often leaves a lasting impression. The avoidant person may start to see that the empath's love was never a weakness. It was an extraordinary capacity for connection, that they were not ready to receive at the time. And now that the empath no longer needs their presence to feel whole, the significance of that lost connection becomes far more apparent. Thank you for sharing this moment of reflection and growth with me. May your heart always recognize its own power and worth. Goodbye for now, and may your path ahead be filled with clarity, strength, and the kind of love that truly honors you.